We discovered, however, abundant dead remnants of these riverine forest strips, enough to prove that they had indeed once occurred. Today there are said to be 130,000 elephants living in the Botswana part of the Khaza TFCA. These animals represent the biggest and most important part of Khaza's 220,000 elephant population. For several decades past, the large and always growing number of elephants that were living in this vast region were considered by many people to have been too many. They came to this conclusion for no other reason than the fact that the elephants continuously engaged themselves in destroying the riverine forests all along the Chobe. The most important elephant habitat study ever conducted in this region was initiated in 1965 by Dr. Graham Child. Dr. Child was a United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization (FAO) ecologist who had been seconded to the Botswana government. He was the first person to recognize that the always growing number of elephants in Botswana had become the biggest threat to their own survival. And because the country's elephant habitats were consequently under severe threat, so too was Botswana's biological diversity. Dr. Child was instrumental in creating Botswana's Department of Wildlife and National Parks. In 1965, the Chobe riverine forest was still reasonably intact, much like the Pafuri riverine forest in Kruger National Park is today, and the Chobe River floodplain, upstream from Kasane, was then covered in tall reed beds. Furthermore, the bush that was growing along the tourist game viewing river road was so thick it hid all travelling motor vehicles from each other. Today, both the reed beds and the thick bush along the river road have gone. Brian Child, Graham's son, now also a greatly accomplished field ecologist, recently claimed that these radical changes were caused by, and I quote, the continuous feeding pressure from tens of thousands of elephants since the beginning of the 1960s, unquote. Dr. Child had a sharp ecological mind, and he was scrupulous in recording his observations, which is how we know that he marked off and analyzed a sample transect of the Chobe riverine forest in 1965. His study area was 1 mile long and 70 yards wide. Science had then not yet gone metric. And in that transect he recorded inter alia 299 large riverine forest trees, including what he called 17 specimens of big and impressive giants. At about this time, a United Nations report brought to the Botswana government's attention the fact that it really needed to start culling its ever-growing elephant population. Sadly, that recommendation fell on deaf ears. Botswana has never ever culled any of its elephant herds. Another important Chobe study carried out by Dr. Child in 1965 was the meticulous counting and measurement of 600 giant trees in the game reserve's Sedudu Valley, and he determined that each and every one of those trees was some 400 years old. Most of them were camel thorns, Acacia erioloba. Some were knobby thorns, Acacia nigrescens. Others were leadwoods, Combretum imberbe, and there were a few other species in the mix. In 2004, 39 years later, Dr. Graham and by then Professor Brian Child together returned to Chobe with a number of university students and academic lecturers. They identified and demarcated Dr. Child's 1 mile long river transect and set about determining what changes had taken place. Much to their surprise, they counted slightly more trees, 324 more to be exact, than Dr. Child had recorded in 1965. However, 270 of these, 83%, were Croton megalobotrys, which could hardly be called a tree. I, for example, would describe the croton as being a large woody shrub. 3 other so-called tree species, previously not recorded, had colonized the Chobe riverbank since 1965, one of which was Capris tomentosa. And as we had discovered in Kruger National Park, Capris, a new and invasive plant at Chobe, was not eaten by elephants at all. Nevertheless, it was much favoured by impala, kudu and giraffe. The 2004 research team discovered that the huge knobthorn trees, Acacia nigrescens, which had constituted 51% of the old riverine forest complex in 1965, were down to only 1.3%. Only 4 of the very large specimens had survived. 6 other slow-growing and very large tree species had disappeared altogether. The only real trees to survive were the unpalatable to elephants Natal mahoganies, Trichilia emetica. However, as happened in Kruger, we discovered later that week that porcupines had started to ring bark the Natal mahoganies at ground level in the Chobe too. The Sedudu Valley is actually a 10-kilometer long depression or drainage line that is sandwiched between the opposing sloping sides of 2 gigantic desert sand dunes, on top of which grew classical mature teak forest. The valley descends from a position well inland of the Chobe River, and it hits the Chobe River at right angles to the river's direction of flow. It also hit the middle section of Dr. Child's mile-long riverine forest transect. At its broadest point, the Sedudu Valley bottom is no wider than about 150 meters. The 204 research team checked every tree that Dr. Child had recorded in the Sedudu Valley in 1965. 91% of them were dead, including all but 15 of 327 magnificent camelthorn trees, Acacia erioloba. All the giant knobby thorns, Acacia nigrescens, had been knocked out. Only 6 of the 22 leadwood trees, Cumbritum and Berby, had survived, but the elephants had avoided all 12 of the unpalatable teak trees, Bica plurijuga, a few of which also grew on the sandy sections of the valley floor. Careful inspection of each and every tree excluded any possibility that the cause of death was due to fire or to wood-boring insects. 352 trees exhibited Category 5 ring barking, meaning that more than 80% of the bark had been stripped off the circumference of the tree trunks by elephants. Only 16 of all these trees were then still alive. We saw none of these survivors when we visited Sedudu Valley in 2021. This is a giant camelthorn tree that I found growing inside the fenced enclosure of the Savuti rest camp. It is the biggest specimen of its species that I have ever seen anywhere. Try to imagine 600 trees of this species and of this size and age growing in one woodland along the Sedudu Valley floor. And just think of this too. It had taken the Sedudu Valley woodland 400 years to reach climax maturity in 1965. And it had taken just 39 years, 1965 to 2004, for the Chobe elephants to kill them all off. As early as 1970, Dr. Child drew up a list of the tree species that the elephants had, by then already, totally extirpated in the Chobe National Park. Amongst their number were mukwa trees, kiat, Pterocarpus angolensis, mugongo nuts, kirkias and coniferas. His notes included the facts that by 2004, all but one of the giant 124 acacia tortoise trees, Harkensterk or umbrella thorns, that had been tagged and were growing throughout the central Mopani woodland areas of the eastern Mubabe in 1965, had been pushed over and killed by elephants. He also noted that the majestic old camelthorn trees, Acacia erioloba, that had once grown in the Savuti Channel area, had been totally eliminated. The list goes on and on. It is seemingly endless. It is an indictment against all previous government administrations in Botswana which have failed to protect the country's wildlife heritage. Thankfully, the new president of Botswana, Mokgweetsi Masisi, is a different kind of politician. Everybody in the country's wildlife industry have expressed great hopes for more responsible leadership in the years ahead. To Dr. Child's list of extinct trees, I now add the observation that during our travels through the Chobe in 2021, the iconic baobab tree, once a very common tree species in the whole Khaza region, was conspicuous by its absence. Between 1965 and 2004, there had been a noticeable shift in the occurrences of several wild animal species in the Chobe. What Dr. Child called increaser species, which included elephants, impala and kudu, had responded positively to the shrub encroachment. In other words, the numbers of these animals had increased, and giraffe, which historically had never occurred on the riverfront, had become common. Note, these are all browsing animals. There was a corresponding and substantial decline in warthog and waterbuck numbers, and nobody in the 2004 research team saw a single bushbuck, puku or blue wildebeest. Dr. Child also voiced his concerns about apparent declines in now rare antelopes like tsessebe, roan and sable. Note, warthog, waterbuck, puku, wildebeest, tsessebe, roan and sable are all grazing animals. This suggests that during the intervening 39 years, between 1965 and 2004, the bulk of the game reserve's palatable grasses had been removed from the Chobe National Park, no doubt by the park's excessive number of elephants. Remember, the elephant is a preferential grazer. So between 1965 and 2004, there had been a radical shift of many ecological circumstances in Chobe National Park. This had, without any doubt, been caused by major habitat destruction wrought by far too many elephants over far too long a period of time. Dr. Graham Child returned to Chobe for the last time in 2007, after which he wrote, "The once magnificent riparian strip, the Chobe riverine forest, with its attendant species of birds and small mammals, has all but disappeared. Furthermore, when my family and I left Kasane in 1965, there was still a magnificent belt of mainly camelthorn trees running up the length of the Sedudu Valley. But by then the elephants had already started to work on them. What remains of these 600-odd giant trees, all over 400 years old, is a handful of stark dead skeletons standing in a sea of scrubby croton bushes." This series of film clips illustrate just how few of Dr. Child's original big trees are left in what was once the famous Chobe riverine forest. The areas where elephants were filmed in this series represents what is left of his 1965, 1 mile long by 70 yards wide, then pristine Chobe riverine forest study area. Note the current state of the invading Capparis tomentosa creeper indicated was not recorded anywhere near the Chobe River until 2004. Now, with a comprehensive understanding of the recent history of Botswana's Chobe National Park, its habitats, its wild inhabitants, its ecological circumstances dating back some 60 years, we were well primed for our 2021 habitat examinations. The principal feature of Chobe National Park nowadays is its extensive floodplain, which varies in shape, size and configuration every year. The floodplain soil is a mixture of Kalahari sand and silt. The sand enters the river when the elephants, quite by accident, with their feet, cascade it down the steep-sided teak tree-covered sand dune that dominates the landscape south and east of the river. The silt is added when the river comes down in flood during the rains. There are two things we don't want to keep reminding you about, but we do remind you to keep a lookout for them anyway. 1. When you see lots of trees and plants with lush green foliage, and you wonder why the elephants don't eat them, you must understand that those particular bushes are unpalatable to the elephants. 2. When you see a lot of standing dead tree trunks, tree stumps, and old logs lying on the ground, understand that they are indicators of a time, not too long ago, when the habitats were still healthy. They are the remnants of selected and favored tree species that the elephants have eaten into local extinction. Indeed, we are witnessing the final steps of this total habitat destruction when we see fresh evidence of yet more tree damage today. It is safe to say, however, that the most important and most favored of the natural elephant plant foods in Botswana are all already locally extinct. In the 1960s, the floodplain was dominated by a continuous 2-meter-tall Phragmites communis reed bed that has since been eaten into local extinction by the elephants. Today, the reeds have been replaced by a very palatable short-cropped rhizomatous grass called, I think, Panicum repens. It covers practically every square centimetre of the vast floodplain soil, and it is eaten by every animal that ventures out onto the open ground. We saw elephants, hippos, buffaloes, kudu, impala, sable and tsessebe in very small groups, all eating that magical green floodplain grass, which they kept cropped very short like a suburban lawn. In many places the grass is so short it is difficult to understand how any animal was able to pluck even a single leaf off the grass plants, which it seemed had melted into the ground. Over the next several days we explored the tourist river road game viewing track that followed the low course of the southeastern Chobe River bank. We also followed the sandy bush track high up on the main sand dune, which gave us a grandstand view of the floodplain below. And we followed the game viewing track inside the teak forest, high up on the dune, to confirm that the teak forest hereabouts had no understory vegetation whatsoever. We hired a motorboat and followed the river far upstream from our camp, and back again, which gave us a good ground-level perspective, or rather a river-level perspective, of the entire floodplain, and of the high red-coloured sand dune that towered above us all afternoon. Even from the river far below, the individual teak trees on the sand dune were clearly visible, and the uncluttered red stain of the open sand confirmed the complete lack of understory plants beneath and between the trees. Unlike the elephant sand situation, where there was a high preponderance of bulls in the elephant herds, those on the Chobe floodplain comprised mainly cow herds. There were, however, 1 or 2 small bull groups too, none of which exceeded more than 3 animals. The behavior of the elephants on the floodplain, to begin with, was an enigma. They scrambled down the steep side of the sand dune and then spilled out onto the open plain every morning by about 8 o'clock, and they spent the whole of the day out in the hot sun, wandering about hither and thither. Some of them went for a drink at the water's edge. Some of them found puddles of muddy water and had a mud bath. Every now and again a small group waded across or swam across the water to get to one of the islands. A quick glance suggested there were longer swamp grasses growing on the islands, and that was the attraction. Closer scrutiny, however, told us that was not the case at all. None of the elephants ate the longer grass, which was stiff, dry, brown, and seemingly unpalatable too. It was blistering hot, and staying out in the open sun during the heat of the day was not normal behavior for elephants. In other game reserves, between 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning and 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, elephant cows and calves, and bull groups too, seek out patches of shade somewhere deep inside the silence of the forest, and there they doze away the sweltering midday hours, sleeping on their feet, rocking gently to and fro to keep their sleepy balance. Only the babies lie down during these midday siestas, and none of the elephants return to serious feeding activity until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Most of the Chobe elephants did not follow such a routine. And then suddenly I saw what the elephants were doing. They were not just standing idle out there in the open grassland, as I had first thought was the case. They were all digging up the rhizomatous grass roots of the floodplain short shorn grass. This activity was not carried out in any kind of hurried manner. It was executed with the slow, deliberate and methodical forward shoveling action of their front feet, their giant toenails digging into the hard ground to the depths of a single centimetre, and each shoveling action removed a slice of dry surface soil, some 5 or 6 centimetres in width and maybe 10 in length. The reward for such meticulous activity was just one small bunch of fresh grass roots, no bigger than half a handful of spaghetti, which each elephant gently picked up with the dexterous fingers of its trunk and committed to its cavernous maw. Once I understood what they were doing, I looked across the large expanse of the floodplain and saw that there were elephants everywhere digging up grass roots in the same manner, and it suddenly dawned on me that that was their sole purpose in visiting the floodplain every day. They were on the floodplain to feed. This fact told me that, off the floodplain, there was not much else for the elephants to eat in the local environment. If there was, they would not spend so much time of the day eating minuscule amounts of grass roots on the open floodplain. I have already mentioned that, simply to survive, an adult elephant has to eat 200 to 300 kilograms of food per day. I felt quite sure, however, that the Chobe elephants were not getting that kind of bulk food mass off the floodplain every day. For 3 days we watched the elephants leaving the floodplain in the late afternoon, and we noted that on all 3 occasions they had used the same routes to leave the river and to climb the sand dune mount above it. So on the 4th day we drove along the 4x4 track that ran along the high elevation edge of the sand dune that looked down over the floodplain. We parked the vehicle and we waited. All around us the teak forest was bare and desolate. The unprotected red-coloured sand had been lying all day long exposed to the baking sun. It was still roasting hot, and I again noted that the teak forest was devoid of any kind of edible undergrowth. The shade under the canopies of the teak trees was inviting to the elephants, but except for the odd mouthful of green croton leaves, which the elephants ate grudgingly with very long teeth, there was nothing for the elephants to eat inside the teak forest. There were patches of shrubby thicket, here, there and everywhere, along the lower slopes of the sand dune, all of which had been totally overutilized by too many elephants in recent decades. Up here on the high dune there was no Capris tomentosa at all, but there were small pockets of Croton megalobotris, Combretum elignoides, and Combretum mozambicensis. Indeed, these clumps of trashed thickets extended right up to where we had parked our vehicle. The river was, from our high elevation, far below. The shrub thicket species were all invader plants that had colonized the Chobe National Park since 1965. It was easy to surmise that the thickets had all been eaten down by elephants, but no, that was not the case at all. They had all been completely demolished, seasonally thinned out and reduced from 2 to 3 meters high at one time, down to less than waist height today, and the bark on their finger-thick stems had long ago been religiously chewed off, in situ, from ground level up, by the ravenous elephants. There was truly nothing in these shorn thickets today except the odd single green leaf that interested the big pachyderms. And that was the story that was happening all over Wankie National Park that year. I picked up dead baby elephants that were in extremis, that were actually dying on their feet because their mothers had stopped producing milk, because there just wasn't enough food to feed them, and they couldn't make enough milk to feed their babies. It was a tragic state of affairs, but it was happening all over the national park.
Peace.